Okay, it's 2 minutes past the hour, so in the interest of everyone's time, let's get this Speak Out talk started. So just to confirm that everyone can see the introductory slide that says Speak Out, the Speak Out talks. And I'm not on mute. Fran, are you going to confirm?
We can hear you.
Thank you, fantastic. So welcome everyone to Speak Out Revolutions, the Speak Out Talks. Today's event is sponsored by Visible Platform.
Yep, you can.
Thanks so much, Fran. So just while we wait for people to join the session today, I'd just like to welcome everyone to the call. I recognise quite a few names, but for those who don't know me, my name's Marie Hemingway. I'm one of the founders of Speak Out Revolution. We introduced these talks as a platform for individuals to speak out on topics which deserve attention when it comes to inclusion within our workplaces, so that we could enable everyone to challenge the status quo, and as a community of people, we could advocate for organizational change for more inclusive workplaces. So I'm really excited for our agenda today because my background is in infrastructure. What I'm going to do is spend 5 minutes just talking to you about Speak Out Revolution while we wait for people to join. And then I'm going to hand over to Daisy Chapman Chamberlain, who's going to be talking to us about inclusion in transportation. So there'll be a couple of pauses within Daisy's talk where she'll invite people to add comments in the chat and welcome your thoughts on the topics that she's talking about. We will have some time at the end for dedicated Q&A. So just to encourage people to add your questions in the chat, and we'll spend some time at the end going over those. Just to say, please, if you have any questions that you don't feel comfortable asking on the call, reach out to myself, Daisy, or any of the speakers, and we're happy to have those conversations in slow time as well. Okay, so just by way of introduction to Speak Out Revolution. Speak Out Revolution is a not-for-profit founded in 2020 with a mission to cancel the culture of silence on harassment and bullying in our workplaces in pursuit of the creation of truly inclusive workplaces for everyone. So as an organization, the way that we do this is we host a global anonymous survey, the Speak Out survey, available on our website, that enables anyone to safely speak out about their lived experience of harassment and bullying in the workplace and their route to resolution. And what we do is collate these lived experiences in the Speak Out dashboard, which is freely available on our website, so that people like me and you can understand the challenges that people face that we don't often hear about, and collectively work together to solve that problem, so that we can benefit from diversity of thought within our organizations. So from the dashboard insights, as a not-for-profit, we use those insights to create resources, to provide events, and to drive our campaigns so that we can work towards this goal of truly inclusive workplaces. Just want to spend one moment talking to you about the Speak Out dashboard. So available at speakoutevolution.co.uk/dashboard, optimized for desktop viewing. So please do take a look. We believe this is a safe platform for people who experience non-inclusive behaviours to share insights into what that looks like, so that everybody else can drive change for more inclusive working. If you take a look at the dashboard, we think it shows the metrics that matter when it comes to creating inclusive workplaces. We've got data-driven insights on the lived experiences of unfair treatment in the workplace and the route to resolution for targets of these behaviours. In terms of who might use it, it could be anyone, but we're really targeting HR professionals, diversity, equity, inclusion professionals, and anyone who's an advocate for inclusion within their sector or within their company. And how might they use this? We invite these people or anyone else to invite their employees or their connections to add their experience to the Speak Out dashboard, and then we freely present the collective information so that me and you can use the insights at the company level or the sector level to tailor training, to tailor the D&I program or strategy, and improve internal processes so that we can ensure that the workplaces that we have value contributions from everyone. So thanks so much. That's a brief introduction to Speak Out Revolution. Please do take a look at our dashboard and share it with people that might be interested. We're happy to have conversations with anyone who is looking to solve this problem and create more inclusive workplaces. So please reach out to me if you'd like any more support there. So I'm hoping that we have Caitlin Sim on the call. I'd like to hand over to Kate, who is the founder of Visible Platform, to give us a brief introduction to their platform and application. Are you available on the call, Kate?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Fantastic. Over to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Kate. I'm the founder of Visible Platform, which we founded in 2020 after my best friend and I were harassed on public transport for like the upteenth time in our life. And so we decided to find a platform or develop a platform for reporting all forms of harassment against women on public transport. And as victims of this behavior ourselves, we believe that, like us, many women don't necessarily need every individual man who harasses them to be thrown in jail, but we do want our experiences acknowledged. And we just believe that there is no alternative between having to give a very serious police report and simply having to shrug off the incident. So we created it. So I think, yeah, there you go. Visible Platform aims to fill the data gap that currently exists between crime statistics and women's lived experiences. And users share their stories through our website or through our chatbot. And we use these stories to gain really valuable insight of transport routes and harassment hotspots, as well as provide a community for women to get closure of the issue and to raise awareness of it as well. If you go on to the next slide, there you go. We believe in making activism accessible, data digestible, and women visible. Our users know that we are out there and that we are listening and that we are working towards change, and we love to have them involved in everything that we do. Today, we're actually really proud to sponsor this talk because from personal experience, we know that Daisy is absolutely brilliant and she's such a valuable voice in the sector. And we're just really excited to hear what she's going to say. Oh, Marie, I think you're on mute. It happens.
I was saying such nice things about you as well. I wanted to say thank you so much, Kate, for that overview. Thank you for sponsoring our event. I am really excited about Visible Platform as an application, both from my own experiences and from those who I know. So really encourage anybody working in the transportation sector, please reach out to Kate and understand how you can use this application or promote this application within your industry. That would be absolutely fantastic. So thanks so much, Kate. Now for the main event, I'm really excited. I'm going to invite Daisy. Do you want to take over presenter mode? Daisy is going to talk to us about inclusion in transportation. So really invite comments in the chat. And I'm excited to hand over to you, Daisy.
Fab. Thank you. Let's hope that the screen sharing works. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Amazing. Phew, that's the hard part over then. On to the actual presentation. Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, the really lovely words. So I'm so glad that, Kate, thank you for being so enthusiastic about my presentation. So hi everyone, I'm Daisy Chapman Chamberlain and I am the Rail Knowledge Transfer Manager at KTN. For anyone who doesn't know KTN, I like to describe us as a bit of a matchmaking agency for innovation. So what we do is we really find those challenges, maybe in a regional, a national, even an international context, and we find the people who have the solutions to those challenges. We can help with funding, we can help with connections into academics, and really shaping policy and movement, for me at least, in rail into the future. So you won't be surprised to know that a lot of what I'm talking about today is quite rail focused, but there is a lot of applicability across different transport forms as well. I've tried to keep it quite general, but if my examples are all train based, that's why. So I started originally as a teacher. I wasn't a teacher for very long, but it was a really good beginner experience in terms of young people, and a really wide range of inclusion needs within that, especially around disability relating to young people. Then I went and worked for an amazing organisation called Community Rail Lancashire. Community Rail is a national movement which links local communities to their rail lines. So it's about advocacy for local people and the services and provision that can come along with that, not just in the actual rail environment, but also in terms of looking after local stations, engagement programs, access programs, and a lot really. Started as an education lead, then I became EDI lead, and I've done lots of projects around young disabled people, young women, LGBT plus people, and I launched the UK's first autism-friendly railway line. Community Rail Lancashire does amazing work, so I really do recommend having a quick Google and finding out more about that. And now, of course, I work at KTN. I'm all about, transport transformation, as it says there, sustainability, inclusion, accessibility. And as I've said, that innovation, funding, stream support, facilitating strategies and really shaping those in the way that, the users need. I'm also a lead in accessible and inclusive mobility, and I'm the vice chair of ITS UK's Inclusive Mobility Forum, and I'm still quite linked in to Community Rail because it really is an amazing movement. So inclusion in transport obviously is why we're all here today. This is really key in the context of COVID. There is a lot of opportunity, but there are also a lot of pitfalls and pain points. So we'll try and race through some of those. And I'm very happy to talk about things in more detail following the talk, if anyone wants to have a kind of further chat about those. I'm going to talk initially about some neurodiversity and disability and LGBT plus vocabulary. Vocabulary, I have found in my experience, is always a sticking point, particularly for people who work in an industry that maybe isn't diverse. So rail is not particularly diverse. We're 84% male. And a lot of the statistics that we have don't really include things around kind of disability or LGBT plus members, so it's quite hard for us to maybe get that landscape fully. And vocabulary can be a bit of a barrier if you don't really know what words to use. I won't read them all to you because I'm sure we can share the slides after today, and it is also being recorded, so you can go away and have your own research time, have a little look at statistics and a little bit of look at actions. And I've put too short a time for Q&A. It is longer than that, I know that now, but I initially put too short an amount of time. One thing that's really important for me to say up front is this is my perspective, this is my learning. I really stress that you talk to others about these topics, that you also do your own research, as I'm sure you all already have done. And we may not get to absolutely everything, so I'll skim over the vocabulary. I'd rather focus on what this group needs today rather than kind of being prescriptive about it, but I'm very happy to talk afterwards. Feel free to drop me an email. And yeah, as Marie said, please do pop anything into the chat so that we can kind of have a bit of ongoing, I guess, engagement through this. So in the context of transport, I'm just wondering, does anyone kind of have any examples or thoughts around diversity and inclusion or equality, equity in transport? Does anyone already have any thoughts? Has anyone come to this particular presentation with any questions? I can't actually see the chat box, so I'm relying on Marie. If there is anything right up front that anyone really wants to ask or get out there or share in terms of your experiences, now is the time to do it. Well, I heard a bling, but I don't know what it says.
So I can see that Martin Griffin has raised his hand. Martin, do you want to unmute yourself and come to the call?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, it's well, quite a lot of you know, I'm disabled myself, and I just want to know how we can move forward from the sunflower scheme, because I don't want to be seen as after post-COVID. I don't want to be seen as an angry commuter trying to get a seat and like in a rugby scrum, because that's what I'm dreading, because that's what it was like pre-pandemic, and I don't.
Yeah. No, I absolutely relate. I think that the sunflower lanyards, I do think are a very good scheme, but they're certainly not. They're not the final solution. They're not a full solution. They're not. They don't meet every need, and there is certainly a lot more that we need to meet around that. So thank you for highlighting that. I'm going to talk a little bit about disability and neurodiversity in a moment as well, but I completely agree. You know, we need to move forward post-pandemic, whatever that looks like, into something that was better than what we had before. So thanks for raising that.
Yeah.
Hi Daisy, it's Marie. So just while people might think to put things in the chat, I mean, there are a couple of things that really got me interested in inclusion in transport a couple of experiences. One is being pregnant. Traveling by train while pregnant is the most horrific experience. I think it's probably the worst, one of the worst experiences, other than being pregnant, of my working life. And I think that there is very little consideration for the additional needs of pregnant women when it comes to train travel. And I actually, as someone who really loves public transport, had to buy myself a personal car, even though I didn't want to, because that need was kind of not being met in that time of my life. And then that kind of evolved into, I have a young child and a pram. Accessibility is, I mean, it's almost like we designed a transport system that excludes people that have those needs. And so I'd be really interested to understand what work is being done or what work is on the horizon to address that, because I really don't see anything around this as a user of that service, if that makes sense.
No, that makes complete sense. And I think actually you've highlighted something I wanted to talk about or mention later, is that it's really, I think in a lot of ways, we tend to think that physical accessibility has kind of been solved. I think in a lot of senses in public transport, we think, oh, well, you know, that must have been taken care of by now. We should move on to thinking about the kind of wider spectrum of diversity and inclusion. And of course, we need to think about the wider spectrum, but physical accessibility in transport is still really, really poor, frankly, in a lot of places, especially in more rural communities. And that's something that we do need to keep focus on as well. So thanks for, highlighting that. I'm just very conscious of time. I can hear Bling. I heard a Bling. I'm really sorry. I don't know who you are, but we will have time for Q&A at the end. So hopefully we can have a bit more of an in-depth chat about that. As I said, I won't read all of the vocabulary, but this is just something that I want to include so that, you know, when you've got the slides after the presentation today, or you can drop me an email to get things directly as well, I really don't mind, just about some kind of quick definitions. So diversity is obviously around difference in all of the different characteristics that we have as people. Inclusion is that removal of barriers, removal of discrimination, ensuring that you can succeed without having to, you know, conceal your true self, your identity in any particular way. Equality and equity, I think those are two really interesting ones. So what I'm going to do through this is just touch on some kind of key points that I get asked a lot, and that through my career I've been asked a lot in terms of focus. So equality is the same resources, rights and opportunity, and equity is recognizing that everyone is very different in a really wide range of ways. So intersectional ways, you know, everyone has a completely different experience of life and different needs through that. So it's allocating the resources that a particular person needs. And there are places and times for both equality and equity, but they do mean slightly different things, so it's worth flagging that. And in terms of vocabulary, I just want to say, in the context of this talk, in the context of any talk in the future, we all get it wrong. You are going to say the wrong thing, the wrong phrase, the wrong terminology at some point in time. Just ask, say sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't know, and move on. And I have heard a lot of things around, you know, putting people into boxes. You know, we've got all these words now. Is this pigeonholing people? It's not pigeonholing people. It's not about being PC. It's about giving people who historically, most of the time, haven't had the language to express themselves. So it's giving them a framework to actually help other people understand and understand needs, and to really, make their identity clear to other people. So there's just a couple of quick points. Lived experience, I'm going to refer to quite a lot through this. So having lived experience means that you have lived that within your own life. So it has to be something that you have you know, experienced and lived through. Of course, you can have family links and you can have friend links, and those are extremely valuable as well. And then we can talk about kind of being allies. So an ally for gender diversity, an ally for inclusion, whatever it happens to be. Nothing about us without us is a really common phrase for a lot of different communities, groups, charities that involve disabled people. That's absolutely crucial to avoid stereotyping. You haven't lived an experience and you're kind of developing a project in that space. It sounds obvious to involve those people, but you'd be surprised how many times it doesn't and hasn't happened. And I mentioned intersectionality, and that's how the overlap of our identities, so perhaps the overlap of your gender and your religion and your disability, and that can add different perceptions. That can be, that can add positive discrimination, negative discrimination. It can, really impact your life in different ways. And I've talked about discrimination, unequal treatment, harassment, obviously conduct and behavior, mostly in the workplace, but in any scenario. I wanted to highlight BAME or BAME. This is an interesting one at the moment. Obviously, I'm white, so this is not a space where I'm going to put my voice out there. I'm not going to say in any way that I'm an expert. I really recommend you go away and talk to people from various communities and ethnic minority communities about this. But there are increasing conversations now that it's not an appropriate term to use, and that actually using the term ethnic minorities is, the preferred terminology. That's me flagging it, not an expert, just wanted to make it something that I'm putting out there. And the medical model is one thing. It can be a useful tool, but saying things like disease, saying things like suffers from. So suffers from autism, for example. We just don't use that terminology. There is a time and a place, but it tends to be in a hospital, and no doctor would kind of use that particular phrase anyway. But a couple of flags. So disability, at some point in your life, you probably will temporarily or permanently experience disability. So 15% of the global population live with some form of disability, and the number is increasing as our understanding grows, and obviously as the population grows as well. You're disabled under the Equality Act. In particular, if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term, so that's 12 months, negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. So again, I'm using quite sanitized language there, but that is from the Equality Act. Again, I want to flag, you never say disabled and normal. You say disabled and non-disabled. We don't use words like handicap. If we've got any kind of American friends on the call, it's particularly an American thing, but in the UK, we certainly don't. Differently abled, diverse ability, these terms are not really what we use anymore. Again, there may be people on the call that prefer those terms. This is my experience, and this is, from my lived experience and my training and career, etc. And mental health does fit into that, so it is considered disability if it's long term. So again, 12 months plus, and you can see there, dementia, depression, OCD, and many more. I've put in a few more kind of definitions that I'm not really going to have much time to touch on. So age discrimination, pregnancy and maternity discrimination. I think it's really worth highlighting that 54,000 women lose their jobs every year for getting pregnant. That 390,000 working mums experience negative and discriminatory treatment at work. I just want to highlight those because they're pretty shocking statistics. So really encourage you to go off, find out more about those. Of course, race discrimination, I've already covered off. I cannot speak to that. It would not be appropriate for me to speak to that, but I'm very much an ally in the space, and I am happy to refer you to people who are experts in the space, who have lived experience, if that's something you're interested in finding out more about. But of course, it's about unfair treatment due to race, and religious and belief discrimination, much the same. This is an interesting one again. I get this question a lot. Is it disabled person or person with a disability? Unfortunately, there's no simple answer. It does vary from person to person. So the best thing to do is ask. I mean, many times the easiest thing to do is use the person's name. But if you do need to refer to someone's disability, if that's something that they've agreed to and they've given you consent to do for a particular project or a particular topic, a lot of people, myself included, do prefer disabled person because it's an intrinsic part of our identity rather than say, the example I've given there as person with autism is not really something you'd use. You'd say autistic person. So my kind of a really useful way to, I think, explain it is, it's not something you can put down like a handbag. It's not a woman with a handbag. You can't put it down and walk away from it. It's a disabled woman or it's a disabled man. However you prefer to refer to yourself, of course, is the most important thing. But this is just, it's a question that crops up a lot. So I thought it was probably worth referring to. There are some really interesting definitions in here about avoiding and different terms to use. Again, I won't read through all of them just because there's physically not enough time, and I know that you can all go away and have a look at these later. Disabled is a description, not a group of people. So you would say disabled people, not the disabled. We've talked about medical labels, considering using people with health conditions rather than just all disabled people. So again, not homogenizing the group. Suffers from, we've talked about. Confined to a wheelchair, not really a phrase that we would use. One thing that comes up a lot, and this is quite often questioned in a PC term, it's not PC, but using phrases like blind drunk, for example, or deaf to our pleas, not particularly inclusive in terms of our language. And I think they all crop up in everyday life. But it's something that we should keep in mind as we move forward into a kind of more inclusive society. Neurodiversity versus neurodivergence is an interesting one. So in groups of diverse, individuals diverge. So neurodiversity is a group term, that's the diversity of human minds, whereas neurodivergent would be the kind of singular term. So you would say neurodivergent, I'm a neurodivergent person, rather than neurodivergence. So it can be a slightly confusing one, but that comes up a lot as well. And the kind of opposite of that is neurotypical, which is often NT, which is the normal. We're talking about this in a social standard, of course. If you took it to kind of the logical end, no one is neurotypical because no two brains are the same. But in terms of social standards, that's what we're talking about. So when we say neurodivergent versus neurotypical, or alongside neurotypical, we mean the kind of socially accepted standard. Loads of terms here as well. Allistic is one that a lot of people don't know. So if you are not autistic, you are allistic. I like that. I really like to highlight that, just as a kind of opposite, and to flip the kind of narrative around that. And spectrum is an interesting one. So again, for autism specifically, we don't tend to say high functioning and low functioning anymore. Again, because that's quite medical. You're autistic or you're not. So you can kind of communicate your needs within that, but that's not really something that we touch on in education and healthcare very much anymore. And there's some interesting other bits and pieces, but I'll leave you. There's a glossary at the top, so I'll make sure that you get the glossary. We are absolutely racing through. I know that, but I'm very aware of the time, and I wanted to make sure we got through all of this. I'm just going to touch on the top two: LGBT+, obviously lesbian, gay, bi, and trans. For anyone who doesn't know, LGBTQIA+. Now, I get a lot of questions about if you should use LGBT, LGBT+, LGBTQIA, LGBTQIA+. The short answer is whatever the people you're working with prefer. So you should be working with people with lived experience. You should be consulting. You should be having conversations. Whatever they prefer is the right answer. I have always used LGBT+ because the plus stands for encompassing a wider range of identities, because you're going to see how many terms I put in here in a minute. There are a lot of different terms that could be kind of encompassed in that particular acronym. I've always used plus, and the people I've worked with for these projects have always been happy with the LGBT+. But again, it's worth asking. And I've put in loads of different ones there as well. The pronouns are an interesting one. It can be really helpful to ask people's pronouns when you're at the start of an intimate meeting, to make sure that you know what people prefer to be referred to as if you're not using their name directly. Queer is also an interesting one. I've given quite a few LGBT+ vocabulary training sessions, and people in rail in particular, so maybe older people who work in rail, I have been asked, is that not a rude word? Is that not an insult? Is that not a slur? Because historically it perhaps has been, but that's something that's kind of being reclaimed by the LGBT community. So you can see there again a little bit more information. I might breathe now. So I just want to pause to reflect. Is there anything that anyone wants to kind of bring up, and the kind of discussion that we're going to move on to? Is there any specific examples about why this matters and why we're discussing it that anyone wants to raise?
I will just jump in, Daisy, to allow people to put comments in the chat, because I did have a bit of a question around the terminology for disabled people or persons. So I think this is something that I've recently become educated on, and I'm looking to you to correct me if I've been doing this wrong. So I really subscribe to this social model of disability, especially in the context of transport. I don't think that a person with reduced mobility, or me when I was pregnant, was classified as disabled in any way. It was the environment that highlighted that I was not perhaps as able to use that service as someone else, and the structures in place and the way that I was treated, and perhaps other people have been treated. So I typically say person living with disability, because I see it as this problem that the environment is creating for them. And I'm wondering, I'm just wondering how appropriate that is and whether or not I should default to disabled person, because to me it feels like I don't want. It feels like a little bit of a label that says it's kind of their problem, and I think often it's not their problem.
It's the social problem. I completely know what you mean. I think straight up front, no one is gonna kind of criticize you for using, you know, living with. So quite often referring to something like dementia, we would say living with dementia. For autism specifically, autistic people, autistic person is very dominantly the preferred term. There are kind of variations within this. I completely take your point. It is the environment. We live in a world that is built for a very specific type of person, and that does not include, you know, anyone with kind of reduced mobility. It doesn't include disabled people. We are facing, you know, the barriers are social rather than from the people themselves. The reason that I've said, you know, disabled person is it's almost about empowerment as much as anything else. So it's about disabled isn't in and of itself a dirty word. So when there was that kind of trend about saying differently abled, there is nothing wrong with someone being disabled. There's nothing wrong with me referring to myself as a disabled woman. So in part, it's about empowerment and actually saying, you know, for you know, however many centuries, we have not talked about people beyond kind of, you know, neurotypical, non-disabled, allistic people. We've been talking just about them. And now here we are, I can actually get some recognition. I can get some understanding of my needs. And I want to use the vocabulary that, you know, goes along with that. I want to refer to myself proudly in that way, because that's something that's important. But it does vary from person to person. I mean, the age difference, I think, is a really strong one. It completely varies across communities. I think the best thing to do is to use living with. I don't think there's any problem with using that. But as always, if you're referring to kind of specific people, specific charities, specific groups, you're obviously going to be working with someone with lived experience. The best thing to do is ask. So I know that's not an easy answer, but a lot of it does kind of come from that empowerment and, you know what, no, I want to refer to myself in a specific way. And I expect you to kind of, not you, but people to be respectful and aware of that in terms of planning, design, whatever it happens to be.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And just to say that John has added something in the chat. He says the phrase mobility impaired is often used. Many people can be mobility impaired at some times, e.g. traveling with buggy like me, or shopping, and not at others. How does this fit with inclusiveness vocabulary?
There's absolutely, yeah, it's in terms of a phrase, it's something that we use very often. So it's, yeah, completely fine to use as a phrase. As you said, I think it was John, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it's completely fine to use as a phrase. It doesn't normally refer necessarily to kind of, you know, long-term disability or long-term need. As you say, it may well be at specific times, but it is useful to have, I guess, in your back pocket, so that you can refer to people who maybe aren't accessing services as easily as the people that those services are realistically built around. So people who are non-disabled, most of the time men, for example, and we're going to come on to a bit of that. I'm very aware of the time. I can hear the bings, but we will have Q&A at the end. So I'm just going to jump on. Obviously, we're here today because the transport system in the UK and around the world is not inclusive. I just wanted to throw this in. Obviously, I've been very focused on disability and LGBT plus identities so far, but I wanted to throw in the women in transport sector. So these statistics are from 2017 to 18, and you can see the percentages of women. Maritime is by far the worst. My maritime colleague Matthew is doing a lot in that space to kind of think about diversity and inclusion in maritime, and you can see the information for the other sectors. And realistically, moving on to the statistics, you know, we've talked around the 15% figure in terms of disability, but thinking about some other kind of areas of diversity, men are almost twice as likely to be a manager. The UK's gender pay gap is 15.5%. If you are disabled, you're more than twice as likely to be unemployed as a non-disabled person. We've all heard about the CV work, I'm sure, that's been going on in terms of the names that are on your CVs. British citizens from ethnic minority backgrounds have to send an average of 60% more job applications to get a positive response compared to white counterparts. I want to flag the hate crime rise that we've had. So hate crime incidents reported to the BTP has increased by 24% from 2012 to 13 to 2019 to 20. Religious hate crimes has also increased. LGBT plus hate crimes have increased. 1 in 3 disabled people feel there's a lot of disability prejudice. I want to highlight there's a really fantastic piece of work from the Research Institute for Disabled Consumers that 52% of their panelists said they were unsure about returning to public transport after COVID. And only 1 in 10 organisations reported neurodiversity was included in their people management practices. All of the links for all of these statistics are in the notes section, so you will be able to look at the kind of full reports when you get the slides as well. And why does this matter? I think ultimately there is a tendency, of course, the business case for diversity, but ultimately it's the right thing to do. For individuals, for families, for communities, companies, national and global sense, everyone deserves the chance to have opportunities. I think that's just really, that is the kind of, it's hard not to draw a line under that, because of course, I'm sure for everyone on this call, that is fundamentally why, that is why. But of course, it does also lead to more profitable business, making employees feel more welcome at work. It increases retention, increases cohesion, you get higher innovation results, you get faster problem solving, you get more creative teams, and of course you get the reputational benefit as well of being a diverse business. Again, everything I've referenced, there are notes and comments as well. A DFT study found differences in the perception between men and women. So 3 out of 5 women felt unsafe in multi-storey car parks, waiting on a railway station. Half of women felt unsafe travelling on a train. Half of women in London have been victims of some kind of unwanted sexual behaviour. I believe that statistic has, there is a lot of variety in that statistic. In some cases it is higher. There have been different surveys and studies, so I would really welcome more research in that and having a kind of more detailed look. The purple pound is how we would refer to the spending power of disabled households. £249 billion is something that most businesses would want to tap into. And it is important that, we keep in mind that the business benefits as well. If that's what gets people involved, that's what gets companies involved, fine. I would like them to get involved for the just straightforward reason that everyone deserves to have opportunities and to be able to thrive. But if they need to get involved because of the business side, at least they're getting involved. And of course, compliance in terms of the Equality Act. So I put the protected characteristics in there and at the start as well, so you can have a look at those. I wanted to just highlight the COVID-19 crisis has had a huge impact on a lot of these. So these are the gendered statistics. So the unemployment rate for women has been kind of starker as a result of COVID, and you can see that the furlough rate has been higher for women as opposed to men in terms of the job losses and things like school closures, etc. This is just something that I think we need to keep in mind, is that we kind of, there's been a lot of, we're all in the same ship, we're all on the same boat, for example, through this. And in some ways, yes, we very much are, but in other ways, there are a lot of people who have found this a lot harder. A lot of people who have been discriminated against through this crisis, either directly or indirectly. And I think it's really important we keep in mind that, people have not been equally impacted at all. And that includes women, that includes people with a really wide range of different needs as well. With COVID in mind, these are the UK COVID-19 transport statistics. So you can see that rail, and this was a couple of weeks ago, was at 37% compared to a percentage of an average pre-COVID day. The huge thing for us that's very recently come out in rail last week is the Williams SHAPS plan for rail, which has got enormous potential in terms of diversity, but there isn't any direct reference to gender or women. There isn't any direct reference to LGBT+. There isn't any direct reference to hate crime. The references, to be fair to my colleagues, are to inclusion and accessibility. And that's great. There is a national accessibility strategy which has been promised, but I think this is an opportunity for us to do a lot more. I think this is an opportunity for us to focus in, and the report does reference diverse workforces. The rail sector should reflect the people and the communities that it serves, but I think we need to recognise this in rail, at least, as a time for bold action. So making employment commitments, consultation commitments, confidence and collaboration commitments, and actually talking to those groups. So whilst the general feel is good, I want to see more coming out of this, but that's just to give you the kind of transport stats. The shining light is cycling. cycling has had a bit of a renaissance, which is really good to see in terms of active travel. But again, inclusion needs within that, and thinking about how we can make sure that cycling is inclusive in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the provision of the, bicycles that people use, and making sure that people actually are able to access that regardless of their background. So much to consider. Again, I will not read all of this to you, A, because time, B, because, it's not great to sit and read, but this has always been an issue, and this is something we need to really focus in on as a result of COVID-19. So even just the perception of rail as being unsafe, it really does disproportionately affect people. It can cause social isolation, and we need to make sure that we're generating those long-term benefits in terms of mental and physical health and well-being as well. Accessibility in a health and mobility sense comes to the fore, so that's stress and anxiety, green spaces, active travel, I've mentioned, community stations work as well. If we're thinking about sanitation and cleanliness, that benefits vulnerable people. Automatic doors and accessible entrances, yes, benefit people in terms of the transmission of bacteria and viruses, but also make it easier for passengers with pushchairs, passengers with luggage. So kind of a really wide range of benefits we can see out of this. Passenger information in terms of how that's actually provided, so written, visual, auditory in the environment, and digital provision as well, are kind of really key pieces for inclusion moving forward. In terms of the crowding as well, that's something that we've seen obviously a huge reduction in, so now we need to think about how we make sure the environment can still be calm, or as calm as possible, moving forwards. I think one of the biggest kind of cultural shifts that we are now starting to see is that need to have a more environmentally focused and green way of thinking. So we must make sure that COVID, the dip in rail numbers, it can't lead to everyone using personal cars. That's not environmentally sustainable, and it certainly doesn't meet with our net zero targets. But thinking about green spaces as well in terms of enriching well-being. I wanted to mention marginalised groups. 73% of workers in the poorest fifth of earners in the UK often have no choice but to use public transport. Thinking about the inclusion of homeless people or unhoused people. Toilets and water fountains in stations are key facilities. So Manchester Piccadilly is a really key example of this, and are often used as really important facilities. So thinking about the fact that this isn't optional, this is something that we need to be enriching as we move forward as well. I wanted to highlight these as some resources that we did for an EDI in transport event. The videos are really interesting. You've got the link and the password there. Again, when we get to the end and you can have the presentation, you can have a look at those. And I do recommend having a look. One for rail, one for aviation, and one for maritime. I also wanted to put in some references to office and working environments. So in terms of how you can make sure that your office and working environment is inclusive. A lot of these are focused on gender and disability specifically, and of course not exhaustive, but worth referencing. And in transport environments specifically, of course, lived experience is absolutely crucial, and making sure that we have the kind of full breadth of understanding that we need to shape systems. So what I mean by that is people directly within your team, the people that you consult with, the people that you work with in terms of community groups. I've mentioned Community Rail, can't shout loudly enough for that organisation, for that movement. Really do recommend that there. And I've talked about rail information provision, lighting, flexibility in terms of services. Hate crime, I think, is a really important one at the moment. So thinking about the 3 E's of education, empowerment, and enforcement. So making sure that you are educating at all stages of life and across society. So not just in schools, but educating people through the rail environment as well, through outreach work, through advertising, pushing out. I mean, the amount of people I know that don't know about 61016, which is the British Transport Police text reporting line. They're very, very efficient. There are also some really interesting training programs through the Proud Trust, which is an LGBT plus charity in Manchester. They run a training program which is called Be a Bi Supporter, Not a Bystander, which is how you can safely help someone who is a victim of hate crime, or if you yourself are a victim of hate crime, how you can, report that and how you can get support for what has happened to you. So making sure that people are safe, making sure that that is really clear, I think for transport moving forward is absolutely crucial, especially if the kind of statistics continue to move the way that they are as well. And I realise I've just absolutely thrown information at you all, and I hope that some of it has been interesting, and I wanted to highlight some individual and company actions that we can take. So I think the top one is one of the most important, is that lifelong learning. This is never done. This is not a static topic. You're never going to get to a point where you can kind of, you know, dust it off and put it on the shelf. That ongoing learning is always really important. You can see a lot of examples that I've given here in terms of amplifying voices, working in partnerships with networks and charities, lived experience. So I'm going to give a few shout outs in a minute to a few networks. Things like company policy, name blank hiring, for example, is a really, really important practice. So we talked about the kind of ethnic minority issue in terms of CV, you know, the 60% figure that I said, in terms of 60% more CVs, more applications than their white counterparts. That kind of thing can be extremely valuable in terms of making sure that your recruitment processes are more inclusive. I know we've got only about 13 minutes left, but your one thing I will do is something I'd really love to hear in a minute. So you can feel free to reference any of these as well. That can be as an individual or as a company or anything just really that you want to ask. I don't mind if you've got any questions. Shout outs, obviously visible, who have already presented. The Walk Safe app, the Walk Safe platform is another really fantastic one for women. Neatbox, I think I referenced very early on in the presentation, but that's an amazing piece of kind of accessibility software for disabled people. The Passenger Assist app was released yesterday, I want to say, or the day before. So that's a passenger assist app for rail specifically. I recommend checking it out. There's also the Close the Data Gap project at the University of Southampton, which is really fascinating. Networks, I can, you know, for any area of transport, we've got women in rail, women in transport, women in maritime, women in aviation. All of these I can give links into for anyone who is interested. And there is a brand new gender equality toolkit in transport called Get It, which is from the Future Transport Visions group. It's a really, really interesting piece of work. So if you haven't seen that, recommend checking it out. And I will stop talking now and ask if anyone has any questions or anything that they want to refer to.
Thanks, Daisy. That was amazing. I'm going to just skim back through the chat and pick up on some comments that people have made in case you would like to comment or have a bit of back and forth on it. So Jess, love Jess. I used to work with her at Jacobs. So Jess, I know does a lot in rail. She says inclusive design enables everyone to contribute to society, which benefits us all. And only diverse teams can design inclusive systems. And I am in violent agreement with this. It's interesting to see your perspective on how much of this do you think, like one thing that I see is companies will do, you know, stakeholder engagement sessions with disabled people to talk about how they include them in rail, while at the same time employ very few disabled people that are actually involved in how investment decisions are made and, you know, having people present in the room when things are being done that have inbuilt assumptions just based on that lack of visibility of wider needs. So I guess I'm wondering how much of this is getting people in our workforces that represent the communities the service will serve versus engaging more fully with people with those perspectives. Interested in your views on that.
Yeah, I think it has to be quite an even balance. So you're never, I mean, especially if you've got a smaller team, you're never going to be able to kind of encompass every area of diversity. You're never going to be able to get in, you know, a completely full range of people that may have every particular need. And this is where the kind of social model, obviously, it does come in. It's about the barriers rather than the specific needs. But the specific needs are also incredibly important. So what I would say is that balance. It's making sure that your team is diverse. It's making sure that you are building in, and if your team isn't diverse, building in those structures for the future, education and engagement programs, making sure that you are engaging with the next generation. These are really, really important things. I'll go back. This is one of the ones that I've highlighted. That inspiring the next generation is really important to make sure that you're kind of, future proofing. But then if you are in that situation where maybe you've not got an enormously diverse team, you know, perhaps historically, of course you don't want to be in a situation where you're kind of firing people to hire someone from, you know, a different community. I don't think that's anything that any of us expect. And I talk to a lot of SMEs and they do kind of say to me, well, Daisy, we employ 7 people. We physically can't afford to employ another person. You know, we didn't realize having an all-male team was going to be, 10 years ago when we started, maybe it was a different landscape. And now we feel a bit stuck, and it's okay, well, what can you do in terms of then the consultation beyond that?
Mm-hmm.
Not just the consultation, but actually having structures in place to listen and make improvements and make changes. So one of the things that I absolutely abhor is when you see, yes, there's been consultation, great, what's happened? You have to be able to then justify what has changed or been different as a result of that consultation. Otherwise, you're doing it's lip service. So I think it is that combination approach. For a big organization, you've got no excuse. You should have diverse teams and you should be consulting. If you're a smaller team, perhaps there's more kind of flexibility in it, in terms of, yes, it's harder for you to employ, but how are you actually making sure, what is your internal policy for listening to that feedback?
Absolutely. And actually, this is just to chip in with Speak Out Revolution's work. It's absolutely an area of interest for us, because what we're seeing when it comes to maybe non-inclusive behaviors in the workplace, where you want people to bring in their perspectives, their different perspectives, actually something like 70% of people will never share that. And so actually, if you want to tap into the diversity of thought that exists in your organization, you really have to create safe spaces for people to come forward with the challenges that they face in the workplace, so that you can maintain that diversity of thought. Okay, so I'm just coming to a comment from Jess around terminology. So she's talking about persons with restricted mobility is something that's used, and then that can encompass people with kind of big suitcases traveling on public transport. And she's talking about how you'd model and design for persons with restricted mobility at Heathrow T5, for example. And then Alison's, this is a really insightful comment. So Alison is a mobility assistant helper within stations, and she's mentioned how they have a lot of people that will come with lots and lots of luggage which have a need, but then there's also people with genuine needs, genuine need for assistance to do with maybe an intrinsic disability, and talking about how often in her work she's taken away from helping people that have a genuine need, and so there needs to be a slight differentiator between those two things. I'm just wondering if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. I mean, your need based on a particular given moment in time can obviously change and be, it's completely variable. And a person with any need, a disabled person may have a different set of needs on one day than the needs that they may have on another day. So again, it's very easy to think about wheelchair users or people who use wheelchairs in particular when we talk about accessibility in rail, for example. But obviously that isn't the case in a lot of situations. It's not a person who uses a wheelchair, it's a different need, or it's a different guidance or accessibility or inclusion need. What I would say is that whilst obviously we need to make sure that we have provision for all of our passengers, we need to make sure that we're kind of considering the more vulnerable groups first. The word vulnerable is, it's a challenging word to use, because it kind of conjures up someone who can't, necessarily take care of themselves. And that's not what I mean at all. I mean vulnerable in the context of the rail environment, in terms of the specific support that is required. So again, it comes back to that kind of social model. It's vulnerability in that social context rather than the person themselves actually being vulnerable. So it may well be that some kind of identification of those needs and priority according to those needs is something that could be explored. But again, at the same time, we'd have to be extremely careful in how that was done to make sure that we weren't inadvertently excluding someone who perhaps didn't want to fully disclose everything that they needed support with, and perhaps they were using a different reason to make sure that they had support in terms of wayfinding in the station, but they didn't want to give a stranger all of the information about the needs that they specifically have. So whilst I completely take the point I think it's about striking a balance, and realistically about making sure that our environments are kind of already as inclusive as they can be, making sure that we've already got as much kind of physical accessibility. I know we've got loads of Victorian stations, but how can we make sure we retrofit wherever possible, making sure staff are available and trained as much as possible? What can we do to support staff as well in this? So yeah, it's a really kind of tricky question, I think. But I'm happy to have kind of a longer conversation about that if anyone's interested at another time.
Absolutely. And I think we got time just for one more. And there's one here from John that particularly interests me because I spent some time working in investment decision making. So John says, rail is dependent on government support and has to justify its spend through a very structured business case process where in that decision-making framework where no or very little value is given to inclusiveness. How do we change that mentality? So it almost sounds like the people are missing from the room that create the structures by which we invest in rail, so that inclusiveness is not on a par with some of the other things that are valued by the majority or by our specific narrow focus on service delivery. So what do you think we can do to change that mentality or influence the way in which we spend in rail?
Yeah, it's a long-standing issue, and I think that this is what we hope that the kind of William Shapps plan will start to rectify. So for anyone who isn't aware, we're going to be kind of converting over to Great British Railways in the next couple of years, which means that the infrastructure and the kind of majority of operations will be overseen by this new organisation, Great British Railways, which will absorb Network Rail. So it'll have that overarching control and that overarching, priority setting across the country in terms of what we need within rail. Now, the William Shapps plan has specifically referenced accessibility. I don't necessarily think in as much detail as it perhaps could have, but of course this is the initial presentation, if you like, the initial reporting, very detailed, but very much the first step. So it will now be what comes after that in terms of the building in. And I think that this is something we can view as an opportunity to really build in accessibility and inclusion into Great British Railways. And that actually the fact that that isn't being done in a kind of broken up way across, we kind of our old franchise-based system in terms of rail. We won't have those franchises anymore, that actually will have shorter contracts, but that ultimately the control will come from GBR. I would like to hope that that means consistency and collaboration are things that we can improve. So the best and most important changes are the ones that will be identified and prioritized first. But it's very much it's a time of change for rail. So I would very much hope that that's something that is a positive change as we go forward. But again, very happy to chat more about that as well.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for the talk, Daisy. And I guess I would just love to encourage people on this call who work in transport, if you are in those conversations, if you're in the rooms working with clients, have accessibility and have these conversations at the forefront of your mind and be an ally for people that perhaps aren't in the room yet, while we work on getting people into the room. So I'd like to just say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Daisy, for your amazing talk. This is an area that I'm really interested in. I feel like I've learned a lot from this. So thank you so much for that.
No, I'm so glad that you found it useful. Please do drop me an email. If anyone wants to talk about anything specific or any further resources, very happy to do more signposting.
Wonderful. Thanks, Daisy. And then we're at time, so I'll just say thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you found this talk insightful. Our next Speak Out talk will be on the 23rd of June with Danielle McLeod, who is one of the founders of Remarkable Women. She spent her career working in HR and will be talking to us about how we need to disrupt HR because the processes and systems that we have in place do not serve those that they're intended to serve. So please do follow us on social media to be the first to hear about that or join our mailing list. And I hope to see you all at a future event. So thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic day. And thanks for joining us.